discuss amongst ourselves as well as with the guest. But with that in mind, I just want to encourage people to ask questions and also be respectful and open to other ideas. And then for the layout, I'm going to be talking to our guest, but we're also going to intersperse with that half turn and talk questions, which is a question that I'll just put out for you guys, and you will turn to each other, people around you, and just form little groups and discuss the question, then we'll come back and discuss it as a group. So I think that's about it. Okay, so with that, I'm going to introduce our guest today. This is Jessica Reed. Jessica is an adjunct professor at Butler University, where she teaches a first-year seminar on physics and the arts, delving into ways in which physics is portrayed in different forms of media. Jessica received her bachelor's in science and physics and her MFA, which is a master's in fine arts in poetry. And she's actively involved in the local community, leading workshops in creative writing at the Indiana Writers Center, as well as at public libraries. So I'm going to ask you, Jessica, to share a little bit more about yourself.
Okay, thank you, Gia. I appreciate that. So yeah, I guess I should just say, let's be real, like the reason that I'm here is because it's really hard to find an appropriate guest, because if you've read the book, you know that, I guess I should lean in. If you've read the book, you know that this is a problem. So we looked, Jill and I were going back and forth for a while trying to find someone. So about me, I have experience as a physics student in the mid-1990s at Purdue, so I can shed light on that, what it was like to be a woman in physics, and it is the it's like you're being initiated into a really rough club, and it took me a really long time. Well, it took me a long time to unpack what physics really is about, but it took me almost no time to figure out that I wasn't really gonna belong. But I stuck with it for the degree, but it is not a welcoming community. But in physics and the arts, the class that I teach at Butler, we do try to deal with issues of inclusion. We talk about women and others who have been traditionally sidelined or underrepresented or even erased from history. So, and we try to bring in a lot of voices. So, and then I've assigned this to my students, and I've talked about this at the Da Vinci Roundtable, which is another, maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's a local roundtable on science and art. And what is interesting about that is I've been in conversations now with 18-year-olds and 80-year-olds about this book. And it is a really provocative, passionate, important book. And I've seen a whole range of reactions, and maybe we'll talk about some of that tonight. So, and I'm really curious to see what this group has to say.
Thanks, Jessica. So I'm going to start off with a question for you. And don't be nervous. So I want to just kind of cover chapters 1 and 2, which in general are very heavy physics-based. But in that, Prescott Weinstein also talks at length about physics being essentially a study of things that are not seen, not detected. You don't really know what's going on, and that's why it's, theoretical physics is basically based on that. And so what I wanted to ask you about is she also connects these ideas in physics that are based around things that you can't see with social constructs. And she I think, in a very nuanced way, explains those things, the social constructs, and connects it to the physics that she studies. And so my question for you is, how or what do you think the role of physics is as a field to help us understand some of these social constructs that are so important?
Yeah, that's great. And the way that you put that is slightly different from the way that I read it, so that's even great. It's a new angle to the question that I just absorbed from you. So, well, first about the unseen. I mean, part of the romance of physics to me has always been that unseen, what the physics of the invisible, and whether you're talking about subatomic particles or black holes, you know, or whatever it is. There's something really attractive about that. And I think part of the fantasy that a lot of people have going into physics, if I get too off topic, remind me back to, but she talks about wanting to just sit down with Lagrangians, which are just, you know, it's just math, and just to sit there and kind of discover the secrets of the universe in peace, because the universe does not care what you look like. It does not care who you are, you know, and certainly that was part of the appeal for me. It's just this, it's not cold, but it's impersonal in the wonderful way. In the, you know, we're all made of quivering energy particles popping in and out of existence. But the reality intrudes. So, and to get to your social constructs, I think, okay, so you can talk about the reality being that we don't have enough diversity in physics, we don't hire enough people of color, we don't hire enough women, and we don't cite their papers or give them credit for their research, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one thing, but I think what's so fantastic about the Disordered Cosmos is she calls out the culture for some deeper things. So it's not just about our practices that can maybe be superficially addressed, but it's really deep bias that's folded in. So, I mean, one example, she talks about the Snell's law thing, which stuck in my head, you know, so it was actually Persian who studied that. And that's like one level of bias, but you can even dig deeper and think about how that stuff is maybe folded in. Gender constructs are real, and physicists are used to, this is more the new angle, like, physicists are used to accepting that things that they can't see are real, and so but physicists do consider themselves hard scientists, and they look at social sciences as more soft, and this might come up too later, but she uses data, you know, she talks about these problems in a way that I think it's very difficult to argue with. You know, she really makes it clear, and, you know, things that I felt when I was an undergrad, and I'm here, like I said, as like an analogy person. But as a woman, some of the things that I felt were sort of ill-defined, and only later did I learn about things like stereotype threat, for example, like, you know, before, if they give boys and girls a math test, and if right before they remind the girls that they're girls, they don't perform as well as if they haven't been reminded, and things like that have been studied and have been verified. And once I started accumulating knowledge about those things, I was like, oh, so there's a language and a science for what I experienced.
Yeah, it's just not as quantitative as physicists might be used to. Yeah. But I still think it's interesting that, like, she does talk a lot about how physicists are aware. I mean, it's their study is of things that they don't know anything about. A lot of times it's based on theories that takes years, sometimes decades or centuries to prove. So they're acting in like a framework of, well, I think this is real, and I'm just going to set out to prove it. And yet, from the way she writes it, there's still a community that find it really hard to accept other, certain other ideas that are more qualitative, which, you know, the way you describe it, social constructs sometimes don't have enough hard science backing behind them. Yeah. And so maybe that's why, but it still seems interesting that it's physicists who are pretty used to having a vague idea of what they're doing sometimes, or they're kind of just working on faith in a sense when they're working.
Provisional reality.
Yes, okay. There you go. And yet they seem to have, apparently, according to the author, a harder time accepting.
So maybe I talked about the romance of the unseen, but maybe the flip side of that is that if you happen to be white cis male, you don't have a whole lot of other problems. So if someone calls attention to some of these other social problems, it's easier to just say, well, I don't care about all that stuff. I just want to do Lagrangians in peace, which is what she wants to do, but it's not so simple.
Yeah, other factors that come into play. Yes, okay. So since you brought up how much she clearly loves physics and wants to be able to do her work in peace, and the end of the book with her letter to her mom is basically about, the freedom to be able to do science or do anything else that you truly love, the freedom to just be able to do it without things in the world kind of being able to hinder it. Is very important to her, and she was afforded some of that because of her mother. I'm going to go to page 67, where I'll let you guys turn real quick. So she talks about physics and how it's kind of helped her uncover more about herself and her identity and who she is. And so on page 67, she writes, "To borrow a word from the indigenous communities that my Black ancestors probably came from, I'm a griot of the universe." I think I said that right. A storyteller. And so I looked up the word griot, and it is any of a class of musician entertainers of Western Africa whose performances include tribal histories and genealogies. I just thought that was interesting because I never knew there was a specific word for them. And so just generally, storytelling is something that is, used for keeping history and passing down information across generations. But even in science, the way that storytelling is sold to me, probably was sold to you, is actually a way to engage people and kind of bring them in. And it's more about keeping people interested in what you're talking about. And so the first turn and talk that we're going to do, I'll let you guys, I'll say the question, I'll let you guys turn and talk to each other for about a few, maybe 7-8 minutes, and then we'll come back and discuss it as a group. So my question is, did you find Dr. Prescott Weinstein's structure for the book an informative way of storytelling, not only to teach you more about physics, but also to teach you about how life as a Black woman is in the field? Okay, I'll start the timer.
What did you think as far as storytelling?
So I didn't mean for this question to be like a yes or no, like yes, it was great, or no, it sucked. But it is supposed to be a discussion because, in my opinion, the physics part of it, the first few chapters were really hard. Yeah. I am not a physics person. I tried to initially when I was reading, I was like, okay, I'll keep track of some of these things and I'll highlight, I'll write down notes. And then I came back to it after a few days and I was like, I don't remember any of this, which is totally fine, right? Okay. But at the same time, for me, it was harder to understand the physics unless she paired it with concepts that were either examples that were so clear, or if she paired them with like some of her really nice like social commentary that she had going, then I was like, oh, I can kind of like, if anything, it was easier to remember because I would think about something and I'd be like, oh yeah, she used this physics as example to connect this,
So
which I thought that method of storytelling I think is very clever. I haven't read a lot of popular science, so I don't know if this is common, but I thought she did it really well. You could tell she planned it out. You could tell she like sat down and figured out what she wanted, everything. Like she wanted to talk about this. This is how she is going to kind of connect it to the physics.
Right.
And that obviously comes from years and years of thinking about this constantly in your head anyway.
Right.
That it becomes easier for you to like structure your book.
Yeah.
So that you talk about, I don't know, the Higgs boson particle and like how it means something bigger. Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so, and had you heard that it started as a collection of essays? That then she was like, okay, sweet.
Yes.
I've got these essays, many of them published. I'm just gonna like.
Yes, I'm aware that she's published a few of those like chapters before.
But then she said that when like the process of it, it kind of like all the essays unwound, and she had to, like change. She had to make them work together.
Yeah.
And then she started to realize she had bigger and bigger plans, maybe, or the project was taking on new dimensions. But what you said, so if I had a criticism from a writing point of view, it would just be that beginning part, it's so in the weeds. And so it's a lot of, like I said here, like I'm a physics nerd.
Yeah,
I
saw
like,
that.
okay, why are we getting this, why are we learning this right now? Because it wasn't folded into, but then later, I feel like it picks up more later.
So you think that the first few chapters were necessary even with the extreme detail because of how she lays out the rest of the book? Is that accurate or no? You think she would have done with less?
Either I just would have edited it differently. Like
okay.
I think her love of physics is showing.
Yeah.
And I think that's great.
Mm-hmm.
But so this is hard because like Griot, like on the one hand she is telling this cosmological origin story, which is amazing.
Yeah.
But if she's listing, the quarks and she's it's just that particle physics gets really, it's like family trees, branching, it's a lot of details.
Yes.
And so why do people need to know some of that? Because some of that doesn't come back. So
right.
So
and you're right. It's the family trees is accurate because I at one point was like, should I start making diagrams myself? Yeah. And then I was like, what's the point?
Right.
But I think that I guess it depends on what you wanted to take out of the book, because for some people who wanted the actual physics of it, or maybe if she's if people in the physics department are reading this and maybe she's trying to appeal to them to look at all these other things in the department, but also hear some physics to kind of keep you interested.
Sure. That
I could understand. But for the general public, the physics part is, I think, at least, okay, I'll say it from my side. And again, this is not a criticism, but for me, the physics was less important than her experiences and the criticisms and commentary that she had for physics. And a lot of it, I think I could have understood even if she didn't give me any background on what physics is.
Right. Yeah.
But at the same time, I appreciate like some of it because of the art of it with the way that she folds it, So I don't think I'm a yes or no either.
Okay.
I'm like I loved it, but I definitely don't remember the physics.
Yeah, and so just if I were being a ruthless editor, I probably would have pared down some of that towards the beginning. The I Heart Quarks section,
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean it couldn't have come up later. But I was thinking, like, if I were the editor, chapter 8 might be how I'd open the book. And that's like, it's the part where she just basically says her mom took her to see A Brief History of Time
Mhm.
about Stephen Hawking, and she really wanted the book, and her mom didn't think she should get the book because she wouldn't be able to handle it, and then
Yeah.
her uncle got it. All that was like amazing storytelling,
Mhm.
but it captures some of the fear for a body that's not working and a brain that is,
Mhm.
a brain that's rocking the far reaches of the universe.
Yeah.
So I
Mhm.
felt like the whole book should have
With that?
begun with that.
Okay.
I don't know. I haven't
Yeah,
recently
I
reviewed the very beginning though, so of her beginning. So
I don't have opinions either way on that, so I'll take that because yeah, I was always definitely engaged whenever she reached back into like her childhood or talking about like history that was related to either her or like just like prominent features in history that were
Right.
important,
yeah,
especially the female
right.
mathematicians or physicists that are left out, things like that. And again, I think it's me because I'm interested in things like that. It's more engaging. But I think just in general, if storytelling is her, method for reaching out to people,
Yeah,
then the physics sometimes tends to boggle that,
right.
in my opinion. So yeah.
I just thought of a moment that I thought was really super exciting, and I just want to make sure that it's Vera Rubin 41.
I think we talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. It's a super, super cool moment. You brought about women scientists and Vera Rubin, who discovered dark matter.
Yeah.
There was that moment in the conference when she was like, "So what do you think?"
Yeah.
That was so exciting.
It was. Yeah. I read that and I was like, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Right?
But even if you weren't a woman in STEM, I think even then it's like or a person of color in STEM, it's very engaging and prominent that like this is a very small moment,
Right.
but it is something that like changed her
Right.
view of what her role is in physics, and I think that's a big deal. It's a big deal that people oversee sometimes, like mentors who could make a potential difference.
Like missed opportunities. that
Exactly.
mentors-
Yeah.
100%.
I'm gonna bring us back, and I think I'm gonna
Yeah, I don't know what your takeaway is going to be. That's all
structure.
you.
Yes. Okay. Hey, Rufus. Rufus.
Rufus.
Rufus. We're back. Good. Okay. Hello? I can just shout. I know. I know. It is another thing I was thinking about briefly, and I'll mention it later, maybe like not in front of everyone, but I completely understand. There was a scientist who reached out in Canada, right? I forgot her name.
Yeah, sure, Himiko.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the fact that she said it's not really, her.
A duty.
Yes, I don't want to quote her, but yes,
Yeah.
that was the gist, and I was like, I totally get that because if I'd invited her here,
Yeah.
it would be very hard to have like primarily white audience and not really be able to connect. Yeah. Hello. Sorry. Okay. All right, we're going to come back, and I want to give you guys a chance to share if you guys had any opinions or ideas. If you want to raise your hand, we will bring the mic to you. So the question again was, did you find Dr. Prescott Weinstein's structure for the book an informative way of storytelling, not only for the physics, but also to learn more about her experience as a black woman in physics? Does anyone want to share?
Yeah, we talked, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about how, or we lost a couple people in the book before it ended because the physics was uncomfortable or difficult or whatever. we talked about how if you're reading this book because you're interested in the particle physics part, that's front-loaded in the book, you know. So she hooks you in with that, and maybe that was on purpose to get who's her intended audience. Maybe people who are interested in the field and may not know what to expect. So we thought that was a clever structural organization for her to do it that way.
Krista is snapping. Good job. That was that was a very interesting take. Jessica, did you want to share anything about that? Because I think we talked a little bit about how she started the book with the physics kind of heavy loaded.
Yes, and I was telling Jill that I just try to read it imagining that I'm not coming from physics at all. And there were times at the beginning where I thought, we're really in the weeds right now, like really deep in the weeds, and I'm wondering how some of this is going to come back or whether it will. And often it didn't. But that said, you know, we were talking about how wonderful she did, and things like chapter 8. So for me, I wanted chapter 8 to open the book, and that's where her mom takes her to see A Brief History of Time, and she wants the book, and her mom doesn't think she should get the book because it'll be too difficult, and then her uncle gets her the book. This is just great stuff, you know, and it's narrative, and it hooks you in. But I actually do understand what you were just saying, your table about that who is the intended audience for the book, and maybe there was some reeling in that she was planning on doing. So yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of the topics that she discusses, the issues in the department or the field of physics, if her intention is at some point to inform people and also people in power in the field so that they can change things, then it's probably important to give them something to actually keep them interested in the book beyond just the, you know, social commentary that she has.
Yes, and it increases her cred. Like her credibility is really firmly established there too.
That is a really good point. That might have been intentional then.
Probably.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I probably don't need the mic, I don't think, but
The mic is mainly for the live stream people to also be able to hear.
I think the physics chapters really did establish her credibility. She's brilliant. And so without that portion, you might be more likely to dismiss the rest of her ideas and thoughts. And that immediately struck me, was that she could have gone a full book just about physics. You've been like, wow, this lady is super brilliant, speaks for itself. But then the second subject matter, it just lends her more cred, like you were saying.
Awesome. That's definitely a different viewpoint than what I think I took on. So I like hearing that, because I already had I follow the author on Twitter and I know how brilliant she is. And so for me, it was just like, well, I already know you're a great scientist, and I wanted to know what she talked about in the later parts of the book. But I think that's actually very valuable. If you're coming in with no idea about what the field is like or what her work in the field has been like, then this is actually a great way to start the book. So
I don't know if I guess I'll just say this, but about the cred, with the roundtable, I did have one person who read the book thoroughly, was awesome in the discussion, but then sent me an email. He was a physicist. He sent me an email with like an enumerated list of things that he thought were wrong in the book. And so I was glad he didn't take that angle in the discussion, but yeah,
that we're wrong in the physics part, like the science of it all?
minor things, like the first gravitational waves came from a collision of neutron stars and not black holes. And I actually made the same error in a poem that was published in Scientific American. So like, I sympathize with her on that particular error. So yeah,
Okay.
It's a minor. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not her work. So yeah.
Yeah, that's allowed maybe.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
I kind of think that the whole point of the book is saying that she doesn't need more credit, and that like she already has all the credit that she needs. And I think that really the point of front-loading physics or talking deeply about physics in a way that might not be understandable is just because she's able to do that. Like she is controlling this environment completely, and she doesn't have to worry about her colleagues who might be looking down on her or might be discriminating against her. Like this is her arena, this is her
That's a great point. I did, even while reading, I did think that even though there were things that I did not understand, I still thought that she was able to write well for like a general public or general audience that would be reading her book.
Yeah, and to her specific qualifications, she's where particle physics and cosmology meet in the tiniest area. So she's like at the tippy top of the mountain of physics, like she's the pinnacle. So
Yeah, it shows.
yeah.
Any other thoughts to share? No? Okay. I'll move on to a question that I have for Jessica that's actually really open-ended. So we can take it wherever you want to take it. But chapter 10, which I when I was reading it, I highlighted pretty much everything. And I wanted to quote pretty much everything, but I'll just draw your attention to a few phrases or lines. So page 168 and 169 is where I'll kind of focus. So this chapter is titled Wages for Scientific Housework, and it kind of encompasses a lot of the added burden on minorities in physics that they have to face in their careers. So on page 168, she writes, "The people who get most swept into this academic housework are people who aren't white cis men." And then she goes on to talk about the kinds of things that they're expected to do. So researchers from minoritized groups, including gender minorities, and especially those of us of color, face an extraordinary burden in academic spaces. We are expected on paper to perform like our straight white male peers. She then goes on to talk about all of the things that she has to do, like writing competitive grants, publishing, teaching well, earning great student teaching evaluations, in addition to the actual research that she'd have to do day to day. And then on page 169, she also talks about, we also find that minority students see us as a needed resource and will knock on our door or send us emails asking for urgent help as well as existential help. And so a lot of these things that she mentions are things that don't really get them necessarily help them get jobs either. So they're things that you can't necessarily put on a CV or be rewarded for or noticed for. But at the same time, it's almost required. When I think about like even my experience as a woman in STEM, a lot of times when I would feel like I didn't belong, I would go to people in my community for support, and that included usually women in STEM. And so it added kind of an extra thing that I had to do in addition to my research, where I'd have to seek out support for things that I don't think other people necessarily had to face or had to consider. And so what I wanted to talk to you about, this very open-ended question, is, do you think that physics or academia can ever really overcome this problem?
Right.
There's no yes or no question.
Right. No. Yeah, so this is where representation matters, right? So I do have, to answer the question, it's not yes or no, but I do hope so. I do hope we can overcome this, and this may be controversial, but I think corrections are in order. Like if you're flying a plane and you're too far this way, you got to go the other way to kind of even it out. And so historically, that argument has taken place in all kinds of areas, like of affirmative action. Now it's like diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And there are people. This divides everyone. Everyone's an individual on this. I've seen the whole gamut, of opinions, but you don't want to make change in a way that's like just checking boxes, and not doing anything meaningful. But at the same time, I used an example, like if there had been, say, 3 women professors in physics that I could have known, I maybe would have bonded with one of them, and maybe there could have been a mentor-mentee relationship. But then another woman student next to me might have bonded with someone else, and it would have spread out a little bit more. And that's sort of, these little things add up. So it's like there's a cost there's a cost of being expected to mentor if you're a person of color or a woman. And I learned about this from Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote Stamped from the Beginning, and How to Be an Anti-Racist. He was talking about this, maybe compensate professors who are having to take out large amounts of their time to deal with, bringing up the next generation of scientists. And maybe it was an and or, maybe change some of the requirements for tenure or change it around so that that is counted, that this is a part of your time that is valued, and it's not just, you're expected to all happen on top of all of the other burdens.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an easy question. This is what I told my students. I don't know how to make the change. We were talking, I don't know how it all is supposed to happen, but I do think what we can't do, this is my opinion, I think we shouldn't just say, it'll work itself out. We shouldn't say that we have a meritocracy, because we clearly do not have a meritocracy. We don't. That is not what the white supremacist patriarchy, to throw those terms around that are upsetting to some people. They're just meant to be descriptive. They're just meant to describe a system that needs to change. So it's not about attacking individuals. It's just saying, hey, we need to move toward a real meritocracy, but we can't just expect it to happen. Sorry, so I know.
No, that's exactly what I meant when I said this is like a very loosely based discussion, and if there are questions, would be happy to take them too as we're talking. Yes. Sorry.
I hope nobody tries to beat me up in the office.
We'll take you to your car.
I spent a career teaching in the science department, and I'd like to say that I think the school, the institution, sets its own cultural rules, and that's where things can change. How much they value research, how much they value teaching, how much they value student interaction. My school valued the nurturing of the student and the teaching over research and grants. So we were very much aware in the department who was good with students, who spent a lot of time with students, and it was part of their evaluation. So there can be change at that level. I suspect the direction to go in the future is to pay a little bit more attention to faculty tracks that really are teaching-based, student-based, and faculty tracks that are research-based, because yes, they want to bring in the big research dollars and so forth. And I think the more elite institutions are waking up to the fact that they do need to pay more attention to students. This is a change they made about a generation ago, back in the 80s and 90s, when it became more evidence and popular. So that's where I hope that the change can come.
I'll look up the page while you're talking, but I wanted to actually, in line with that, talk about Vera Rubin, which we were talking about before, right? Because she, I'll look up the page while I.
41,
page
42.
42. So there is an excerpt where Prescott Weinstein talks about a female mentor that she did not work with. I believe she was just visiting for a day. And do you want to talk more about it?
I think it was a conference, and Vera Rubin, who discovered dark matter, this is a giant in the field, and Prescott Weinstein was still a student, and Vera Rubin said, so what do you think about the dark matter program, or problem? And for me, that was an exhilarating moment. It's like it was life-changing, career-changing, right? Like, it's just so amazing to have someone talk to you like what you think matters, and then to have it come from a woman, it's really validating.
Yeah, I think even in general, if that's the mentoring approach that people would take, no matter if they're woman, person of color, if that was just the general approach that you would be able to take. So a lot of what you mentioned when you were first, talking about this was that what I got from it, at least, was that I think the first step might just be that we need to teach ourselves that these are problems and just accept it. Yeah. Because until you do that, you're not actually going to be able to address them or solve them in ways that actually make sense. Because another thing I think she brought up was something that was very popular within these last 2 years, especially, is the formation of like committees that are focused on diversity and inclusion and things like that. And I think at one point she even says that the point isn't inclusion, it's just to have the liberty to do whatever you want to do without other forces kind of harming that, or other forces that are standing in the way of your success, essentially.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that's still not as well done, is people actually addressing and accepting that there are problems. Do you think that in your experience, like in physics, do you think that that's common, or that's the right way to describe it?
Well, in my experience in physics, there were no committees of any kind, but obviously, as soon as you say the word committee, all kinds of specters come to mind of just like meaningless, pointless, not going to make meaningful change. And so absolutely, I mean, I think the harder thing to do is to really look inward, or look at a situation that there are no easy, obvious answers to this. But if we could just be honest about where we find ourselves, like.
Yeah, I often think about, like, even when you're addressing the problem of getting minorities into science, or the fact that the numbers are so dismal, is, in my experience, has always been associated with, like, well, we're just not recruiting enough of them, Right. And so there's outreach programs that will target high school or middle school, or sometimes even younger, to get people interested into usually the STEM fields. And then in my time in grad school and after, what I've come to understand is that there's also a retention problem. And so it's not just that you're not getting people to come into STEM fields, but it's also that you're not creating an environment that's beneficial for them, or leads to their success in any ways. And oftentimes it ends up, it ends up harming them in some way, or harming their careers in some ways. That kind of pushes them out.
Absolutely.
And so it seems like that's why there's no easy answer. It's essentially the entire lifetime of a person. You have to keep addressing these issues that pop up.
Yeah, the whole pipeline.
Yeah, the pipeline. And she also mentions pretty much throughout the book that this is a very, whenever she talks about like history and who's been credited, who's not been credited, it's very like European based. Like it's always the European thinkers, even if they've maybe borrowed ideas from other cultures, it's often people like that who get credit. And so it's very rooted to the problem. You can't really, there's too many ways you can solve them. And at the same time, I think people get overwhelmed and take easier routes that don't really address problems. Yeah.
Because it is overwhelming, and it's also painful to stay in that place for very long, no matter who you are. It's painful to have these conversations. I'm actually really glad that you're all here tonight.
Mm-hmm.
It's good. It actually brings up a side of Prescott Weinstein that we haven't really talked about, because there's so much in here. It's so rich, but she is radical, and some of the ways that she's radical, this diversity idea, she's arguing that we shouldn't just look at human beings as capital, like how might they help us, rather we should look at them as human beings. And so what she was saying about what made an impression on me was her argument that every person deserves access to a clear night sky, and that all the things that kind of fall out of that, a child has to be well fed, and a child has to have transportation to a place like that, and a child has to be healthy. And so there's a whole radical politics that is folded in, that she's saying that a lot of other people aren't saying.
Yeah. So I guess the answer to that question was yes, but it'll just take a really long time in a lot of different ways, which I think is good, because we have a lot of that. We have a lot of people thinking about solutions. I think it's just a matter of implementing them and then sticking with them. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. That was a great discussion. Does anyone want to ask questions or have anything to share? I don't want to just have like a back and forth.
Right.
Okay. All right, we'll do a turn and talk so that you guys get a chance to also discuss some things. So in the earlier pages of the book, right after the table of contents, there's a sketch that is by Shaniqua Gay that Prescott Weinstein commissioned, titled "We Were Always Scientists." And this sketch portrays, as quoted on page 17, it's unnamed black woman scientists under slavery. And I think we've touched on this actually while we were talking about this quite a bit with Jessica, that we often discuss in science how women, and that specifically we know now black, Native, Hispanic women are excluded from entering and succeeding in STEM fields. And we just talked about a lot of possible reasons for why that could be. But in chapter 17, which is titled "Who's a Scientist?", Prescott Weinstein writes on page 130, and I might have a different edition, so I just realized I should point that out. But she writes about hidden figures, and she mainly refers to scientists who were working at NASA who were not even really recognized by NASA. Like, they don't even know that they were working there. And these were like female mathematicians and female scientists. And so the question that she posed to us is, what other history is hidden from us? And the turn and talk question I want to talk about is, when we talk about like what I just mentioned, the fact that most of the times when we talk about bringing women into STEM or bringing minorities into STEM, we're talking about the fact that they're just not recruited enough. But to what extent do you actually think that there's enough minorities and we just haven't accurately portrayed their contributions? So essentially their contributions to science have been erased. To what extent do you think that is true? And then also to kind of take that further, are we more biased in reporting and popularizing things in a way that centers cis white men? And that's the turn and talk question.
Fun night.
I keep saying these questions and then like looking at people and they're just like, what?
They knew what they were getting into.
Yeah. Hello. Oh,
And I know the book, so yeah. I'm glad to hear you say you have a different edition because
I think so. I mean,
I don't know.
It's not the same. Hold on.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. I don't really know. It's the first edition.
Okay.
March 2021.
Yeah, this should just be.
I don't know what yours is. Or maybe just because it's online, sometimes it's different.
Yeah. That could
So
be it.
that's why I tried to bring in the chapters so people kind of have a reference. But yeah, okay, so what do you think?
About erase. This one was I wrote the least, but in my head I was like, oh yeah, like of
Yeah.
course, because it's so easy to erase. Like that's
Yeah.
been impressed upon me over the past several years, just trying to gather stuff for my students. Like, whoa, there's another story of a person, and another story.
Yeah.
And it's, the historians doing all this digging.
Yeah.
But it's like.
There's a book that I can't recall. I've just seen it in like bookstores that cover like female scientists that are, I mean, technically none of them are well known because it's not common. But I just thought it was interesting. You need a book that like talks about female scientists, and it needs to be marketed a certain way so it can be kind of fun and engaging and like, able to also reach younger audiences so they understand this is a reality. But I think my issue with this like idea is there's not enough like actual data on whether or not this is true, but at the same time, it makes total sense to me as a woman in science that this is clearly something I know has happened, but I just don't know how or why. Like, I don't have the data to back that up and say, well, this is why they were excluded, of course. Like,
Well, and if someone's
Right?
successfully erased, then they're really.
you don't even know.
So I wrote very little talking about erasure, but I do think, to your point just there, I think that we know about all the exclusion. So
Yeah.
you can't get into the school,
Yeah.
you can't get into the job, so that's already happening. So I'm sure there are people,
but it's enough to know that a whole lot of other people were turned away before they ever got a chance. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really tough question.
I mean, I don't know. Talk more about.
So I think a big part of my confusion with topics like this is I don't know how to explain it in a way that would click for the other person, you know? And it reflects right now that it's, I don't have anecdotes myself, but I know that this is a problem. But anecdotes are not enough. And so a lot of times, just like what we talked about earlier, that because it's not as quantitative, that like, here's how many women have entered physics, here's how many women have not published, or, you know, you don't have data on this, which is really frustrating because we know it's a problem, but we don't have anyone necessarily studying it.
And you're a hard science. I mean, neuroscience is on the
yeah,
spectrum.
exactly.
You're closer to physics, so.
But even then, I guess what I'm trying to say is if this was something that I did want to bring up or point out as a problem in the field, why would anyone who's in power or has authority do anything about it if I can't bring them actual data or information on it? That's I think what I mean when I say that. That like, you know,
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I don't want to step on.
no, of course.
It's like a negative space thing, right? Just because you can't count the number of invisible elephants in the room. That's a bad example, okay? Because there are no invisible elephants. But like, just because you can't count the people who have been excluded, erased. When you have mounting, I feel increasingly confident about the data that we do have.
Yeah.
Like you can't count those people, but we do know about different phenomena like stereotype threat, and I'm trying to think of some of the other terms for like, we know real studies where they put out identical resumes, right? With person of colors.
Yeah, I've seen those.
You know, and so same with gender. Like, we have increasingly, that data is mounting. So it's not the same data as look at this actual person who didn't get counted, because we can't count what can't be counted.
Yes.
But we're learning, I think, enough to make a really solid scientific case that this is real, that's what I'm trying to talk to this 80-year-old white woman about, is that like there is, I'm a white woman too, I know that. I'm not saying that like I'm not.
No, I get it. Yeah.
But she, you know, I think that we can produce evidence.
Okay.
That there is, not to the people you're talking about counting, we can't produce that evidence, but we can produce a lot of evidence about the way